So, welcome ChessMeal viewers, and this is the third episode about the Philidor position. Philidor, this great Frenchman, probably the best of his age in the 18th century, who wrote a book on chess, which I shared with you in the first video, called Analyse du jeu des échecs in 1777. Do check out the Wikipedia page about Philidor, his very interesting character. In fact, he was born in France, but he died in London because at the time of the French Revolution, so that's 1789, he was on the list of banned people because his family was associated with the king. So he fled to London, where in fact he'd been coming every spring to give lessons on chess and to hang out in the London scene. So he fled to London after the French Revolution and tried to clear things up with the French authorities. And he'd finally got his paperwork sorted out that he could come back to France. But unfortunately for him, he died before he could return to his homeland. And in previous videos, we discussed probably the most useful Philidor position that you're going to come up with a lot in your games, which is how to defend a king and rook against a king, rook, and pawn. So you get your king in front of the pawn, and if you can cut off the king, that's great, and if the pawn ever advances, you check it from behind. So that's called the Philidor position, but also called the third rank defense. We also looked at the rook and bishop against a rook, and a technique for winning in this rook and bishop against rook endgame, which is also due to Philidor. We also discussed Philidor's defense briefly, and the loli mate that can come about from the Philidor defense. The Philidor defense is d6 for black. Very solid setup. Probably that would be it. And then the loli trick is this. Oof, that's not it. But anyway, the loli trick is if black takes that queen, he ends up getting mated. So it's a little trap which might make you feel, yeah, let's try and play this and catch some people out. More about that in Tuesday trap videos. Okay, but today we're going to be doing the queen versus rook endgame, which doesn't happen so often, but it's quite beautiful. Now, philosophically, why should the queen be better than the rook? It's because the queen can move diagonally as well as up and down and side to side. So, as the stronger side, the only thing you really need to be careful of is the rook pinning your king and queen in a skewer, for example, or a fork. Not a fork, a pin. Pinning the queen to the king or pinning the king to the queen. But actually there's something else you should have to be careful of, so more about that later. There are also some stalemate tricks you have to be careful of. Now, what about this? That's black's ideas. What about white's ideas? Well, yeah, so white has to be careful about pins and skewers, but what black needs to be careful of is simply being forked, his king and rook being forked, or being checkmated. So black's got a lot more things to be worried about. And so usually a good strategy for black is to try and keep his king and rook close together. But that's not always possible. Now, this is a classic setup where white has succeeded in pushing the black king to the edge of the board, even to the corner of the board. Notice how he's using his king to control the black king, and his own queen is just hanging a little bit further back. There's a reason for that, which we'll come to, which is stalemate tricks. Now, suppose in this position it's black to move. So I claim that if it were black to move, he's in a bit of a zugzwang, that he doesn't have that many good moves. So let's suppose it's white to move then. There's actually a way of passing the move from white to black, and we can see in the picture this triangle. And this triangle is going to illustrate to you how white can actually pass the move to black by means of triangulation. So triangulation is, because the triangle has got an odd number of sides, if we can do 3 moves and black does 2 moves returning to the original position, then we switch turns. We flip the turn. Okay, so let's begin. We first throw in a check at the center of the board. This is the power of the queen. In the center of the board, it's very powerful. And the point of this is the rook can't interpose, or we just take it. And the king can't go to c8 because we just mated on the back rank. So the king is forced onto the a file. And then we throw a check again on the a file. And notice the rook can't interpose because otherwise we have a back rank mate on h8. No defense. So the king has to go back to the b file, and then we go back here. Now, just ignore all the arrows for a moment. Just notice now it's black to move in the original position. So we've triangulated, and so it's now black to move. Okay, so first let's consider, what about king moves? There's only one king move, which is king c8, and it doesn't work at all. So if king goes to c8, well, we just go here and pin the rook. So this is easy. What about rook moves? Now let's explain the arrows. Okay, so all the blue squares are squares where the rook can obviously not go to, because if it goes to here or here, we just take it. Here or here or here, we just take it. If it goes here or here, so if it goes here, we have check and takes. And for either of these two squares, we have check in the center of the board and takes. So the blue squares are all squares which can be picked up either directly or with an easy fork. The red square is an absolute no-no, because otherwise the queen goes to this red square here and it's checkmate. So that leaves 4 squares for the black rook. And we're going to look at each of these squares in turn to show how white can win. But the basic idea is that all those 4 squares are far away from the black king, so that the rook can be picked up with the fork. Now let's just explain how to find the fork. The way to find how to pick up the rook with the fork is you should look at the diagonal of the rook, and then look at the diagonal alongside the diagonal of the rook, and the squares in the opposite corner. So look at the diagonal of the rook, look at the diagonal next to the diagonal of the rook in the opposite corner. So the blue square, or this blue square here, are going to be our target squares, because if we can ever, in fact, especially this blue square is going to be our target square. So wherever the rook goes, try and establish a target square, which is in the opposite corner and on the diagonal next to the diagonal of the rook. Because if we ever can check the king along the 8th rank, then it will go to the 7th rank, and then we can check it along the 7th rank and pick up the rook. So our target is to get to the blue square with check. So how do we do that? Okay, so we check in the center of the board. If he goes to the red square, we checkmate on the back rank. So he's forced to go to the A file. And now we can't go to the blue square directly, it doesn't quite work. So we'll check again from the center of the board. And now he's forced onto the 8th rank, and we have the check on the blue square that we want. Because if he goes up to A6, we have a mate on this back rank. And if he blocks with the rook, we just take the rook. So now he's forced onto the 8th, onto the 8th file, 8th rank rather. And so we check him on the blue square. And actually slightly subtle, notice he can't defend with his rook, because otherwise we come to the other corner and it's checkmate. Isn't that pretty? So he has to move the king, and now we check again on the 7th rank now, and we pick up the rook. And it's game over. Just a quick mate follows. So going right back to the beginning again, we're going to triangulate to pass the move, and then we're going to aim for that blue square and pick him up. Now, if instead he'd gone to this other square here, then we could do a similar technique. We could aim for the blue square and then go check on this square. And if he ever went to a6, we would have mate on a1 because the rook would now be here. So he would have to go back to the 8th rank, and then we could check him again on the 8th rank and pick him up. So notice we could follow the yellow, once we've arrived at the blue square, we could follow those yellow arrows and also pick up the rook. But actually there's a slightly faster way, so we'll just show it. Check. A slightly faster way would just be to go to this square directly, and the idea being go here, check, and pick up the rook. But the way to, even you don't need to memorize these things. The way to do this, you're in this position and he goes to this square here. So you should look at what's the diagonal next to the diagonal of the rook. And so you get these two squares. And we want to check it and then check him again. So we can't go from here. From here to here, they're both 8th rank. We want to be able to switch from the 7th to the 8th rank. So that's why we want to aim for this square, because then we can check on the 8th rank and pick him up. This square gives us access to any checkmate square in case he goes here as well. So it's a way of calculating, and then we have this the yellow arrows to pick him up. So if the rook and king are separated, look at the diagonal next to the diagonal of the rook and aim for those squares along this diagonal and then check and pick him up. Okay, so we're going to use exactly the same strategy if he goes here. We just check in the center of the board. He can't go to the red square, or it's checkmate, he can't block because we just take it. And we aim for the blue square and then check and take. Or if the rook actually were here, we would check on the second file and then on the A file and then take, where there would be a mate. If he ever tried to run to the red square, we could go into the corner and the rook would block and we'd take it. So it's a simple strategy. Now there's actually a very clever way of winning, which I don't recommend at all, if the rook goes here. I already explained the same strategy works. There's another way of winning, which is go here, check. If he goes to the blue square, go check again, and then check again and pick up the rook, which is why he's much more likely to go the other way. And if you ever happen to get into this position, it's very important to get the next move correct. Because the king is actually running away here. And it's quite a difficult move to find. And this is why it's better to be checking along the center and along the main diagonal, so black doesn't have this because of checks on h8. Okay, so the great move here is queen to d6. And the idea of this move is we're threatening mate on this red square, and we're also threatening mate on this red square. So black actually is in zugzwang. He can't move the king. There are no squares he can move the king to. And if he moves the rook, he can't defend both these red squares. There are only two squares on the chessboard that a rook can defend those two squares. They are the square of the rook and the square of the king. So the rook can't move to the square of the king. If you could swap rook and king, then that would also work. But he can't, or if you could land the rook on the same as the square of the king, maybe that would work. Except it wouldn't, because there's queen here check and queen here mate. But the point is he can't defend those two red squares. He also doesn't have stalemate tricks. If you take that, the king still has a square to go to. So black is lost here. But that's not necessarily the simplest way of finishing it off. Probably a simpler way of finishing off after the rook here, as we said before, is to go queen here check, queen here check, then take the corner. So we're aiming. Oh, this is quite a slow way of doing it, but it works. We check again, and then check again, and then pick up the rook. Okay, so that has been the Philidor position, queen and rook a queen against rook. And that's it for the series on Philidor, but just something to leave you with. Now, in previous series, I discussed a lot of variations of the original position, like other queen versus rook endgames. Now, in the case of queen versus rook, there are too many of those to discuss. But I want to show you just one in particular where you have to be careful of. Why was the queen hanging back behind the king? So the reason is because if you ever get into a position like this is in fact a draw for black. The black rook can just check the white king ad infinitum. If the white king ever goes to the e file, there's a pin of the queen to the king. And if the white king ever goes to the h file, we still have a check because of stalemate tricks. If he takes, it's stalemate. And if he goes back to g3, we can actually just force the matter immediately and just go rook h3 check, skewering the queen, and this is stalemate. So in general, in this position, so this is a draw. Now suppose the h file weren't there, suppose the whole position was translated to the left, then the white king could move to a square to the right and avoid the draw. And then black would have to move his rook back towards his king, so king and rook are connected, close to each other, and harass the white queen. And so even if this position were translated to the left a bit, black by this maneuver will have delayed the checkmate by about 20 moves, because he'd have driven the white king very far away, and then he'd be harassing the white queen. So this is not only a drawing technique in this position, but also a defensive idea in other positions. So as the attacking side, you have to be very careful of stalemate tricks. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this series on the Philidor position. We've discussed the Philidor position, how to defend with only a rook against rook and a pawn with the third rank defense. We've discussed how to win with a rook and bishop against a rook, and some of the in the second video of the series. And today we've discussed how to win queen against rook by triangulation, and then triangulation which then puts black into zugzwang. So rook here being the most interesting line, but we can just check, check, check in the corner. You aim for the square next to the diagonal and then pick up the rook. So that's been, and then we finish with checkmate. So I hope you've enjoyed. Do subscribe to ChessMeal. Do check out the other links in the video description, and have a good Sunday.